Right, today I wanted to talk to you about Buddhism. And Buddhism is to Hinduism as Christianity is to Judaism. And what I mean by that is both Judaism and Hinduism predate their later counterparts. And just as Christianity started out as like a sect or even a cult of Judaism until it became a religion in its own right, Buddhism was the same way. It was one of the many variations or themes within the Hindu tradition until it eventually became a religion in its own right. Now, Buddha is a term, an honorific term, which means one that is enlightened. So you could have many Buddhas. There's not just one individual, but there also is a historical Buddha. This isn't just myth and fantasy, but there was an actual guy who received this title of Buddha. And his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he lived in the 6th century BCE in northern India, which I think it might be perhaps modern day Nepal, but they're in the foothills of the Himalayas. And his father was a king, and India at that time was kind of broken up almost like into a feudal period where you had a lot of these little kingdoms, and his father was one of them. But remember, in Hindu culture and society, the nobility, the scholars, the priest were all in that high caste. And I thought it was interesting. I got a couple feedbacks from my Hinduism video, and a lot of Hindus are quick to say the caste system is not part of Hinduism. And I appreciate what they're saying and why they're saying it, but, and in some ways I would even acknowledge that that is true, but in other ways it is definitely true. It would be like if you heard someone give a talk on Christianity and they were talking about some other sect, maybe Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, and you're like, no, we don't believe that. Well, you may not believe that in your part of Christianity, but other sects of Christendom would believe with whatever that offensive statement was. And that's what I think it is with my Hindu critics. And I'm more than happy. I've learned quite a bit from Hindus watching my videos, and some have been very encouraging and some have been correcting. And some are simply defending their view that the caste system is not necessarily a part of Hinduism, but was more like a cultural thing put on it from the outside. And to be fair, the Christians I've met in India also are in the caste system. Even though it's illegal, it was outlawed in 1948. It's like kind of like the civil rights movements in this country. Even though it's illegal to discriminate on race or religion, or in India's case, caste, everyone knows what caste they are. And it still happens. You can't legislate a change in someone's mentality, even though you can legislate a change on the books. All right, so another person who felt like the caste system should not be part of Hinduism was Siddhartha Gautama. And he is coming out of that tradition. And so there is some legitimacy to that critique. And let me give you a little bit of his background. So he's born into this kingdom, a place of privilege and power. But on the day of his birth, a holy man came and visited. And it reminds me a lot of Simeon in the Bible, who was there for the circumcision of Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem. And he asked to hold the child, and he prophesied that this would be the savior of the world. And the same thing happened 500 years earlier with Siddhartha Gautama. On the day of his birth, this hermit came in from the wilderness, this wise holy man, and he asked to see the child, and he prophesied over it. And he said, this child will either become a great warlord and leader and unite the subcontinent of India, or he will bring salvation to the world. And so it was like a double. It was like two paths that he could take. And his father, being a king, said, we'll take option number one, thank you very much. And he can be religious on his own time after he's conquered all our enemies and established us as the premier kingdom in this empire. And the holy man said, well, you know, you can wish what you want, but fate is a tricky thing. And his mother died shortly thereafter. And Siddhartha's father, fearing that his son would develop religious sensibilities, tried to keep him away from anything that might awaken that sort of path in his mind. So he trained him in like the arts of war and athleticism. He surrounded him with beautiful women, with the choicest food. He had summer palaces, winter palaces, and his father basically kept him shielded from anything in the world, any pain, any suffering, any sickness, any death, in the hopes that he would just be single-mindedly focused on power and pleasure. And so it's so twisted to think about, in my mind, that a father would do that. But his father was very carnal and worldly minded. And so he tried to bring his son along that path because he felt that would lead to a conqueror instead of a savior or a liberator. Well, this all went according to plan until Siddhartha reached adulthood, and he had just had his first child, and his father thought, I have him now. He has a wife, he has a child, he has an heir to the throne. Now he's going to want to be invested. But Siddhartha, realizing that in a matter of time, he was going to be the ruler of the kingdom, he said, Father, how am I supposed to rule a kingdom I haven't even seen? You've kept me sequestered behind these walls my whole life. I think I need to go out and see my people. I'm a man now. Let me see my people. And so his father, being very clever, repainted the main streets of the town, and they held a parade. He gave the peasants new clothes. He threw them a feast so they would have greasy lips and cheeks from the food he had given them. He gave them all flowers and garlands, and then he held a parade where Siddhartha rode through the city full of pomp and circumstance and cheers and music and flowers and pleasant smells. And he was just overjoyed by the beauty of the city and the people. Yeah, they didn't have it as good as him, but after all, he was the prince. But they were living good lives. They seemed happy. They seemed exuberant. He was so taken by it that later that night, he got his servant. He says, I'm going to go out and see the city again. And so they snuck out of the palace gates and went to explore the city by night. But this time, the facade was gone. There was no more parade. There was no more incense to cover the smells. The people had put away their fancy clothes and they had returned to their normal life. And on this outing, Siddhartha saw 4 things that he had never seen before. And the first thing he encountered were a couple of old men. And he asked his servant, he said, what's wrong with those people? They're all hunched over and wrinkly, and they're missing teeth in their hair. And his servant said, nothing's wrong with them, Siddhartha. They're just old. And Siddhartha said, what's old? Because his father hadn't even let old people around him, if you can imagine. And his servant's looking at him, he says, Siddhartha, old age comes to us all. And Siddhartha said, even to princes? And he said, yes, Siddhartha, even to princes. And as they traveled on through the city, Siddhartha heard this woman in great agony and pain. And as she's wailing away, he asked his servant, what's wrong with this woman? And his servant said, she's sick, Siddhartha. She has a horrible disease. And he says, a disease? What's sickness? What is disease? And his servant said, Siddhartha, no person goes through life without being sick at least once. And Siddhartha said, even princes? And he said, yes, Siddhartha, even princes. And his servant said, eventually this sickness and death and disease will lead to death. And Siddhartha said, what is death? And his servant took him down to the river where the priest would collect the dead bodies. And his servant said, just as wood or a tree, when it dies, dries out and becomes rigid, so too a person, when they die, becomes rigid and must be burned like wood, and the ashes cast into the river. And as Siddhartha watched the wailing and the grief and the sorrow that was taking place around old age, sickness, and death, this religious sensibility and compassion and empathy welled up within him. And then he met a 4th person, and this was a sadhu. And those were those holy men in the movie Siddhartha I showed you, the ascetics that lived out in the wilderness. And their task was to try to find the secret to enlightenment. And Siddhartha vowed that day that he would not rest until he found the key to alleviate suffering in the world. All right, so that's the awakening part of Siddhartha Gautama. He ends up leaving his kingdom, his place, his privilege, even his wife and little son, because he felt compelled that this task set before him was for all humanity. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his kingdom. It wasn't just about his family. But if every human being that comes into the world has to deal with this suffering, he wanted to find a way to end it. So he traded his priestly robes for rags. He cut off his glorious locks, and he went into the wilderness and became a sadhu, an ascetic. And he began to meditate and practice yoga and to find the keys to liberation. And the culmination, during this time, one day while he was meditating by the river, my little Buddha nature cat, okay, while he was meditating by the river, and I'm talking craziness, he's living off of bird droppings and rainwater. I mean, this is a very ascetic life. And him and his other followers, he'd already become a leader in this scenario. One day while he was out contemplating, he overheard a music instructor teaching his student. And it was probably like a sitar type instrument, which is like a guitar, but with more strings. I think it's a 12 scale instead of 8 like we have in the West, which is super fascinating in its own right. But so he's teaching a student how to tune the instrument. And he tells the student, if you tighten the string too tight, it will snap. But if it is too loose, it will not play. And Siddhartha had one of those aha moments. And he realized what him and his ascetic friends were doing was tightening the string too tight. And eventually something was going to snap, whether psychologically or physiologically. You can't live that kind of regimented, tightly wound life 24/7. So you're going to hurt yourself and or others. But on the other hand, if you're so loose, if you're so libertarian, if you have no self-control, no self-discipline, you'll find destruction in that place as well. It reminds me of the verse in Ecclesiastes where Solomon says, be not righteous over much, and be not overly wicked. Why should God destroy you before your time? And I don't think it's talking about the righteousness like we find in Christ, but I think it's talking about trying to live on the straight and narrow, trying to always hit the mark, never being off, just always being on 100% of the time. And even Solomon's saying, if you live like that, you are going to hurt yourself and those around you. But you can also reckon the other ditch of I don't know, wine, women, and song, where you have no discipline, no self-control. And so Siddhartha Gautama developed what's called the middle way, where you find a balance between these two extremes. And this also reminds me of kind of like Aristotle, who's writing almost the same time, about 100 years later in Greece. I'm talking about the way to happiness, the way to contentment, the way to joy is to avoid excess and deficiency and find that balanced place in between those two extremes. Finally, Siddhartha Buddha got to a stage where he fasted and meditated for 40 days and 40 nights. The parallels are stunning. 40 days and 40 nights under the Bodhi tree. And during this process, I think I talked to you about the 1,000-petaled lotus of the heart and how each petal represents a role or a relationship. And part of the process of yoga is the deconstruction, a pulling back of these petals, of these roles and relationships until you can see what lies within. And we already discussed, for Hindus, they believe what was within is the Atman. And the Atman is God within, or Brahman within you. Well, as Siddhartha is going through this process, and it's interesting, during this 40 days of fasting and meditation, he too is tempted by the Lord of Darkness, which in Hinduism is called Mara. And he tempted him with women, with wealth, with power, with whatever he desired. But Siddhartha would not be distracted, and he kept deconstructing. But the last challenge, the last petal he had to overcome was his own ego. And he had to confront his own self and declare his own self pure illusion. Because as long as you retain this idea that you are an individual self, you separate yourself from the cosmic I, the universal I. And so as Siddhartha renounced even his very self and was able to peel back that last petal, what he saw within was nothing. There was nothing there. But remember, Buddhist nothingness is everythingness. The goal is nirvana. And I've heard it translated nirvana literally means no burning mind. You have a mind that's at perfect peace and rest. No more agitation, no more worry, no more anxiety, no more fear, but a mind at perfect rest. And so upon coming to this place and realizing also that nothing is everything, he was now connected with it all, although there was no him to be connected because he was it. I know it sounds very confusing to our Western minds. He came up with what's called the Four Noble Truths. And this is kind of like if you were doing like a Buddhist creed or something, what are the essentials you need to believe to be a Buddhist? I would throw these in there. So we have the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is this: to live is to suffer. Anyone who is born into this world of illusion, of samsara, of change, of impermanence, will suffer. It's just how it goes. Suffering is caused by desire. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant insight. Because it is when we desire things and our desires are not fulfilled or met, that is when we have disappointment, anger, resentment, bitterness. And so his solution to end suffering is to end desiring. No desire equals no suffer. But if you desire, your desires will eventually lead to suffering, because none of us can have all of our desires fulfilled. And eventually you are going to suffer loss or pain, and these will have to do with unmet expectations. And then the fourth noble truth is called the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path, it's kind of like the Buddhist 10 Commandments in some ways. And it's ways for right living, right conduct, right thinking to help you achieve a desireless state of being. But do you see the paradox here? You can't even desire not to desire. Because if you desire not to desire, and then you end up desiring, you're going to suffer. And then you're going to feel bad because you ended up doing what you had desired not to do. And this is, to me, one of the tricky parts about Buddhism. And I think in that movie I showed you, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, that was his complaint to the Buddha. And the Buddha's response to him was, you're clever, but your cleverness is not going to free you from suffering. In fact, I would state the cleverer people are, or the more intelligent they are, often they suffer the more. Because not only are they maybe suffering physically, but they're also suffering from the mental anguish and the counterpoints going on constantly in their mind. At least that's how it is for me. Any questions on this so far? Whoa, get there. All right, well, let me share my screen. I'm gonna throw this cat out of my room gently because he's being distracting. Can you see that? Yep, okay, I'll be right back. Okay, so here there's a nice little Dharma wheel going, and we have the Eightfold Path. And so what we want to be doing here is to have the right view of life, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. And when these things are achieved, the hope is that those who follow this path will also reach enlightenment like the Buddha did, or like Siddhartha Gautama did. After the Buddha's death, his followers, like in many scenarios, latched on to different aspects of his sayings or teachings, and a variety of scriptures arose being attributed to the Buddha. And these are called sutras. And in that link I shared with you in the class of that library of world religions, a lot of these different Buddhist sutras are in there. There's like the Lotus Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and each of these are adhered to by different sects of Buddhism, and some will rank different sutras higher than others or more authoritative than others. And that's one of the ways we get different sorts of sects or denominations in Buddhism. And just like in Christianity, where we have Roman Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, it's similar in the Buddhist tradition, where we have Mahayana Buddhism, which can mean big wheel Buddhism. I mean, that's a loose translation, but Mahayana. And that's going to be found in like China, Japan, Korea. And in many ways, I would say this is a very loose comparison, but it's more like Protestantism in Christianity, in that there's lots of different versions, kind of a lot more freedom, a lot less uniformity, but people are kind of finding their own path in their own way, even though there are definitely very strong traditions within the big umbrella term of Mahayana. The next major part is Theravada Buddhism, and this is called the little wheel Buddhism. And I almost wonder if it's like Broadway and narrow way in the Christian tradition. But Theravada Buddhism reminds me much more of Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, in that it's much more ritualistic, much more prescribed in the way you dress, the color robes you wear, what you can eat, how you wear your hair, pilgrimages, prayers, joining monasteries, just like people in the United States might join the military or the Peace Corps for a couple years before they go off to school or get married. In Southeast Asia, I know Thailand, I think it's a requirement, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that you have to join a monastery for 2 years before you can begin your life. They just want everyone in that culture, whether you decide to become a monk or a nun, to have that 2 years to learn about the teachings of the Buddha. And then we have like Tibetan Buddhism, which to me, looking at it, it seems more like a hybrid or syncretism between the teachings of the Buddha and the animism, even demonism of the people of Tibet, the pre-Buddhist people of Tibet, who had many gods, many spirits, but it was a very animistic society and culture. And so you have a really interesting sort of overlay or syncretism between animism and Buddhism going on there. Later, you see the same thing with Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia. And you'll see lots of syncretism going on there, even between like Hinduism and Buddhism. And that's kind of interesting. Any questions about the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path? Okay. I found my copy of the Heart Sutra, and it's not very long. I think I'll read it to you so you can kind of get a a feel for it. I'm going to need my spectacles. The Heart Sutra. The noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while practicing the deep practice of prajna paramita, looked upon the five skandhas, and seeing how they were empty of self-existence, said, "Here, Shariputra." And let me explain just a little bit what's going on here. So first of all, a bodhisattva is someone who has reached enlightenment, but they have chosen not to get off the wheel of illusion. And they have chosen to stay here among other unenlightened beings with the purpose and intention to help them reach enlightenment. This right here makes me like Buddhism more than Hinduism, because it's not just about everyone for themselves trying to get enlightened and get off the wheel back into the cosmos. And even though Buddhists also believe in reincarnation, my understanding is that they believe more in like a collective reincarnation, where you're coming back as like a generation or like a group. And so you all want to help each other towards enlightenment, because you're going to have to keep doing this over and over and over again until you get it right. And so there are rare cases where people reach enlightenment, but they choose to stay with their group to try to help bring them all along for when you're all brought back the next time around. Now, the most famous bodhisattva that I'm aware of, and you probably know too, is the 14th Dalai Lama. He is called the 14th Dalai Lama because this is the 14th time he has come back and continued his job in trying to bring love and enlightenment into the world. And I'm not trying to disparage Jesus or Christians by any means, but it's quite a contrast. Jesus basically came saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. Accept me and live in blessedness. Reject me to your own eternal damnation and peril." The Dalai Lama, on the other hand, is willing to come reincarnate again and again and again until every sentient being has reached enlightenment. And we already know he's going to have to come back a 15th time, because there's no way people are enlightened in the world today, at least collectively. And so what a burden, what a task to lay before you. But I love that idea of an enlightened being staying to help others. So that's who this guy is, supposedly writing this, is an enlightened one. Here, Shariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness, and whatever is emptiness is form. The same holds for sensation and perception, memory and consciousness. Here, Shariputra, all dharmas are defined by emptiness, not birth or destruction, purity or defilement, completeness or deficiency. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no memory, and no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No shape, no sound, no smell, no taste, no feeling, no thought. No element of perception from eye to conceptual consciousness, no causal link from ignorance to old age and death, and no end of causal link from ignorance to old age and death. No suffering, no source, no relief, no path. No knowledge, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in the prajna paramita and live without walls of the mind. Without walls of the mind, and thus without fears, They see through delusions, and finally nirvana. All Buddhas past, present, and future also take refuge in the Prajnaparamita and realize unexcelled, perfect enlightenment. You should therefore know the great mantra, Prajnaparamita, the mantra of great magic, the unexcelled mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, which heals all suffering and is true, not false. The mantra in Prajnaparamita spoken thus: Gate gate, paragate, parasangate, Bodhisattva. And if you guys were there for my chapel talk on meditation, I shared that one with the group. And the closest translation I can get to that is gate means gone. Praja, I think, is like an adjective or descriptor, which means really gone to the other shore. You have crossed over. You have left this side and you have crossed over to the other. And that other would be enlightenment, unity with the one. You have left your individual incarnation and you have reemerged with the one. What's so interesting to me, when I drew this out as like a reincarnation wheel, and in each one of these little rungs, I had like an amoeba or an ant or a butterfly or a rabbit or a fox or a coyote. And then finally we get to humans. And with humans, we have all the different rungs there too, like all the different castes and all the different reincarnations you have to go through. And what the Buddha is saying is, why do we have to go through all these different workouts and ladder climbings and reincarnations? If everything is part of the one, whether you're an amoeba, a dog, or an untouchable, why can't they just realize the Buddha nature as well? And what he taught was, you did not have to come back ever again. Everyone could get off the wheel of illusion in this lifetime. You didn't have to come back and go through the caste system and finally become a Brahmin and then finally be able to get off the wheel. But you could get off it now because in essence, there is no wheel to begin with. There is no spoon, if you saw the Matrix. There is nothing to bend, to warp, to manipulate. It just is. And once you can realize you are as in that isness as you ever will be, you no longer have to strive to get there. Hallelujah. And so it becomes a process of realizing what actually is instead of trying to become something you're not. Any questions on that? And I'm hoping you're seeing the parallels to Christianity in a stunning manner right now. At least my version of Christianity. Then again, maybe that's why I have that version of Christianity. Maybe I studied a little too much Eastern mysticism in my day.
Yeah, that's a lot. So it's
And for those of you who aren't aware of my teaching on that, I'll just give you a snippet. My belief is that if we are in Christ, we are already as complete, holy, and righteous, as saved as we're ever going to be. We can stop climbing that ladder of perfectionism or being on that hamster wheel of striving, failing, beating ourselves up, striving, failing, beating ourselves up. And we just get caught in this loop or this wheel. And what I encourage people to do is get off the wheel. You don't have to be on it. It's pure illusion. You are already signed, sealed, and delivered in the one. I believe that one is Jesus, but for the Buddhists, they would see it as they are already part of that universal mind. There's nothing more they could do to be any more a part of that than they already are. So it's a process of realizing what is instead of trying to get somewhere or to achieve something. So when you see Buddhists going through all this workout and rituals and chants and prayers and whatever it happens to be, I would say that they are kind of new or novice Buddhists. They don't really get it, because I would expect an enlightened Buddhist master to simply be in this place where they don't even seem different than an ordinary person. The only difference is they are surrounded by this complete sense of peace and joy and contentment, knowing that they're exactly where they should be and how they should be at that place and time. And they're not caught up in this ego trip. They're not caught up in fear of punishment or hope of reward. They are just being here now in the present, because that is the only place we can be. And this understanding that we are connected to everything and everything is connected to us. And basically the universe am I. And we got like 3 minutes left, and I'm going to leave you with a little Buddha Sutra that Donovan did, and I hope you enjoy that.